Ms. Payne.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for being here today. I wanted to ask about scams, and you've talked about that in your opening statement, and talked about the 4 things that you believe are important to addressing scams. Of course, the code of conduct, information sharing, obligations to act quickly, including to close accounts, and a shared liability scheme. I'm just interested, is Commonwealth Bank already implementing any of those, particularly the obligation to act quickly? How does your bank act quickly when scam activity is identified on your accounts?
Look, we certainly are. And one aspect, the only other piece I would add in terms of the things that we think are important is a single front door for customers to go to when they're in an external dispute resolution scheme. I think it would be very difficult to go between multiple sectors if you're a customer. Look, we are certainly acting as fast as we can. And it's not to say perhaps there are, not that I'm specifically aware of, areas that we could be acting faster ourselves. Where we see real opportunity, though, as well, is for industry and across industry support, where, and I mentioned in my opening statement, we're providing information into an intelligence area which is then shared. This is effective in other domains, and so what we really want to be able to do is see, because it might be a scam that we're seeing that other banks aren't, and they'll move on to another financial institution. It might be a particular type of scam, and there's a lot of different types of scams. So it's in effect the ability to share, then the obligation to also consume that data as an institution across multiple sectors, and then I think having specific timeframes by which to implement those. And I think all of those things, speed, cooperation, sophistication and investment, is going to reduce scams even further. And as I said, it's a huge focus across the entire banking industry. And look, we're having a lot of bilateral engagements. I think yesterday publicly we're talking about one of the partnerships we've done with Telstra. We've worked with several telcos. Some of the information that we're sharing, there's some indicators in the context of the particular, I won't describe them because that would be helpful to scammers, but there's some specific things that happen on a phone and duration and other factors. And so by working together in that particular case, we've been able to reduce scams. We've had some engagement with the technology companies. There's certainly more willingness than perhaps in the past, but as your question highlighted, speed is of the essence here.
Absolutely. Thank you. In April last year, ASIC released a report into scam prevention, detection and the response of the 4 major banks. And the report found that the overall approach to scam strategy and governance was highly variable and overall less mature than expected. And the report found that banks had inconsistent and narrow approaches to determining liability across the bank. It also found that victims are often not well supported and that the ability to detect and stop scam payments had significant gaps. So since that report came out, what actions has Commonwealth Bank taken to protect your customers from scams?
Well, I mean, specifically, I guess, almost to all of those recommendations in varying forms, but I mean, clearly this issue and the losses or impact to customers on a monthly basis is reported all the way through to me and my team and to the board. Perhaps not on a monthly basis to the board, but regularly. We have a very specific objective. We did last financial year. We exceeded that. We have a specific objective in terms of reduction. As I said, we're investing more than $130 million, $800 million across that domain. That is more than we've ever invested. We've brought a number of technologies to market, name check, which can otherwise be referred to as confirmation of payee. We've provided that to other domestic financial institutions. We've provided that to global financial institutions. We've got the ability for a customer to be able to verify that it's us calling them, for us to be able to identify that it's actually the customer we're dealing with. To give you a very simple example, we had a customer who was actually in Brisbane for work. Someone had came into a branch in Victoria and was attempting to take over their identity. The branch staff member suspected something popped a message in the CommBank app. The genuine customer was in a meeting in Brisbane. No, I'm not in an outer Melbourne branch. Message back. Obviously, the scammer ran out, but we've got good CCTV footage. So lots of technology investments, lots of policy changes. And when I say all of that, I would see on an almost daily basis, probably daily basis, really difficult customer losses, and this is the areas where the liability is either not on a financial institution. In some aspects, I think could be greater clarity in things like the e-payments code, because, I mean, this has really emerged. And of course, we start from a position of trying to understand what our legal obligations are, and then where we're prepared to go beyond that, there has to be some principles associated with that. So we've tried to adopt much greater consistency, because, as you would appreciate, not everyone reports scams. People's expectations about scam and the loss that they've suffered varies. The financial loss can be, in some cases, very, very large. And some of the digital wallet scams, less so. That's where people are purporting or get access to setting up a digital wallet on a mobile device. Investment scams. We're taking down, I think, about 50 fake CBA websites per week. To give you an example, so I mean, we've got a huge team. We're working across all of those dimensions. We've made significant improvements, and I believe there is still much more, and collectively much more, that can be done.
Thank you. I've certainly had constituents with very large amounts of money that they've had stolen, and in most of the examples they've raised, it's involved mule accounts, and obviously scammers often use genuine accounts that were opened legitimately to transfer stolen money into these mule accounts. Are you able to provide the number of mule accounts that were opened and saw traffic during the last financial year?
I couldn't off the top of my head. I could undertake to provide that to you separately. There's also, and to the extent that we can, perhaps we can try to categorise. There are different types of mule accounts. As you said, there's perhaps a simpler mule account, one that was fraudulently established by, let's say, a scammer. Now we've got biometrics, facial verification. There are others which are much harder to detect, where it can be instances where a customer is actually facilitating a scam, but they don't realise they're facilitating a scam. They might think, and this is often tied to a romance scam, they might be doing something because they believe they're in a relationship with someone. They're facilitating payments through their account and sort of entirely unknowingly supporting that scam and facilitating sort of a mule payment amount. And some of the there's degrees of shade or grey in some of those. But look, I'm certainly happy to take that on notice and see what we can provide.
Thank you. And I guess the big question is, which I don't understand, why we can't do better to identify the people that are holding these accounts when they are being used in a criminal way, given the way that, a customer has to identify themselves when they establish an account. Why can't banks identify the people that are then, using those accounts to transfer? Specifically
around mule accounts?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in the same way that it's difficult to remove any, fraudulent documentation. As I said, some of the things that have certainly helped, things like facial verification, obviously integration to, identity, and particularly a digital identity solution would be helpful. I mean, I can assure you that we and all of the financial institutions put a lot of effort and cost into knowing your customer, setting up with the right identification requirements. I mean, we use biometrics to try and understand whether the pattern is representative of the customer. Their transactions, we're required to monitor transactions for a variety of different obligations, including financial crime, to screen for payments such as sanctions, to look for unusual activity. There are lots of things that we are doing in that area, and I mean, I'm sure there may be others that we could be doing, and we're looking to do that as quickly as possible. But I mean, this has been, this has been a real priority, and clearly scammers set up multiple accounts, different institutions. We've had some tremendous success at reducing scams by slowing and limiting dollars that are going out to crypto platforms, and that's not a criticism of crypto. It's just a preferred mechanism for people to particularly take money offshore. But we're also, as I was talking to Ms. Spender, I think earlier, about if you think about the 20 million payments per day, the 0.0002%, trying to find those. And I mean, in theory, we could slow every payment and not clear a payment for sort of 2 weeks. Now, you can imagine, obviously, that would have significant. And so we're always trying to get this equation right. I think this is important. It can't all be about efficiency. It has to be about sort of safety and security. Mm-hmm. But certainly digital identity and the expansion of that would be a helpful mechanism for the banking industry and others.
Mm-hmm. And what identification checks currently does the bank undertake to ensure that the people who open the accounts are still the people who are operating them?
So, I mean, a variety of, classic sort of 100-point check, driver's licence, passport, digital sort of subscription services, as I said, sort of, the facial verification, the liveness check. They would be the main ones.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we've heard about cases of people selling accounts to scammers and, possibly leaving Australia after that. Do you think there could be ways that we can ensure that those who are selling the bank accounts are liable in some way for these losses?
Well, I mean, I'm sure they are liable in terms of they're certainly breaking the law. So I'll leave that sort of law enforcement. But again, I mean, your questions, and they're good ones, they're all highlighting the need for greater sharing of intelligence. And just like we see in cyber, and scams and fraud are the same, there are various destinations and areas like the dark web. There are certain platforms where information is being sold. We're obviously monitoring that. There are a variety of different sort of cooperation agreements in place with law enforcement. Sharing information across industries, across participants, can only be helpful to pick up and identify those. We're constantly monitoring in all sorts of locations to see whether any of our customers' information is being compromised, whether it's being sold, and of course, if we see any evidence of that, then we would contact them, put a stop on all of their accounts.
Thank you. And so we've seen data on the amount of reimbursement that goes to customers from the period between July 2021 and 22. The big four banks paid a combined total reimbursement of approximately $21 million, and the rate varied across the individual banks but ranged from only 4% to 5%. When reimbursement occurred, the average amount refunded to the victim was around 36% of what was stolen. Do you think that's reasonable?
It's hard to provide a generic answer. I mean, I'm more familiar with the more recent data. There's some elements of this as well which don't make the comparisons easy. I mean, one way we think about it is the sort of gross exposure. What's the dollar? And I'm happy to provide you with the information. That attempted scams, what are the dollars that we prevented, which are orders of magnitude higher than the number? What do we recover? And then what do we reimburse? Now, the reimbursement, in essence, will be most closely related to, I assume, financial institutions' estimates of their legal liability or where they've sought to go over and above their legal liability. There may be differing opinions about whether that's sort of representative. Again, I think this, to me, highlights there is a number of areas where there's ambiguity, and updating either existing or, as we've talked about in the context of mandatory codes, creating sort of greater clarity and specificity will help. And, I mean, education's a really important part of this as well. I think it will always be the case, and it's very difficult, but if, at the end, customers need to be very wary and careful about where they're sending their money to. Now, there are some sophisticated ways that people are deceived and misled. So I'm talking about, an ordinary, but also, when sort of too good to be true investment schemes or things that look to be, on a reasonable basis, highly unlikely to be legitimate. There will always be I guess some individual customer accountability, but the ones that are very difficult are where the sums are large and the person has clearly been misled, and for all the the important and beneficial parts of Australia, Australians are trusting, and we're very conscious of that. I think it's one of the country's great strengths. Unfortunately, in a world of real-time, irrevocable payments and higher degrees of trust, it also is an area or a reason why Australia is a target for scammers. We're also a wealthy country.
And what approach does Commonwealth Bank take to determining liability when someone's been scammed? What we hope is quite a comprehensive approach. So across all the different scam types, and I'm not suggesting this was all in place in the time frame that you're referencing, trying to understand the different factors, trying to also understand what our legal liability would be in those individual circumstances. And this is important just to establish a baseline. Now, of course, it's up if we would like to go beyond that, and we may in certain circumstances, but then this is something I've spoken with some consumer groups about. There has to be some principles, otherwise it leads to inconsistency. But I wouldn't seek to represent the liability regime at the moment as more than sort of broadly immature. This area has expanded rapidly in recent years, and some of the exploitation that we've seen domestically but also globally was not, I think, contemplated certainly 5 or 10 years ago. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks very much. I'll hand over to Ms Payne.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for being here and the opportunity to ask some questions today. I want to talk about scams as well. I know we've covered some of that, and in your opening statement, you've talked about the significant investment that Westpac has made into addressing scam activity and the reduction in customer losses. I did want to sort of, I have had a few constituents with quite significant losses through scams, and without going into specific details of those in this forum, both of my two constituents, part of the quite sophisticated scams that they were both targeted with were they were asked to deposit money into a Westpac account, which turned out to be a mule account. So I guess just one of the key questions that it raised is, why is it so difficult for banks to identify the owners of these accounts when customers have to present so much identification to open an account? And I understand that, accounts can be sold and etc. But can you just talk us through some of the actions that Westpac is taking to try and identify those accounts and barriers to you being able to do that?
Hand to Carolyn. I think it's a problem of misuse of accounts. So I believe I'm aware of one of the cases that you refer to, and I understand in that case that the owner of the bank account's actually been arrested. So, and broadly, I think we're dealing with 4 scenarios. The first is ID takeover, where someone takes over an ID, and biometrics has got an important part to play, I think, in resolving those issues. The second is accounts that are active, legitimate, and become illegitimate. So accounts, when people leave the country, they can often sell access to their bank accounts. So what we see as a legitimate account suddenly becomes an illegitimate account, and that's an example where we've got to pick it up as fast as we can. The third area is people are tricked into using their accounts. So again, it's a legitimate account. A romance scam is often done that way, but people give access unwillingly, or they think for the right purpose, and the account's used to move the money. And then the fourth one is where people just give access and take a payment for accessing the bank account. So there's a range of misuses in my mind that we're dealing with. It's not all people have setting up dodgy accounts. One of the other areas, before I hand to Carolyn, is companies, and Carolyn mentioned this before. Consumers think if you have an ABN number, you're a real company. All an ABN is a record that you've been registered as a company. There is no check on what you do or whether you're a legitimate business when you get an ABN. So that's an emerging area that I think we've got to focus on. But Carolyn?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. I think finding accounts that are used for illegal purposes is really challenging. We have done a range of things to try and address the problem. The first one is transaction surveillance of all inbound payments. And, I think I mentioned earlier on, we're looking at, 30 million events a day. We've got, masses of people sort of dedicated to looking at all of those things. And we're looking for authorised payments that may be unusual, unauthorised payments that are unusual. We're looking for a range of things, money that might come in and out quickly, large sums of money that come in that might not normally come in. We are really active in the faster bank inter-cooperation. So we've spoken about the AFCX, so making sure that when we see that information, the banks are working together really well to make sure that if money is moving from one bank to another and it's for illegal purposes, that as soon as that information is known, we act on that really, really quickly. And what we're doing at Westpac is the biometrics for onboarding. At the moment, we have it in place for anything that we might think is a high-risk area or where we see issues. By the end of this year, we'll have it biometrics everywhere. But it does go to the earlier point that I raised, which was about the document verification service. So what would be really helpful for, I think, the community more broadly is, first of all, the digital ID, but even for the document verification service that exists. If we're paying for the service to say, is that your passport, is that your Medicare card, it would be fantastic if an SMS could come into your MyGov app and say, Westpac has just tapped on your passport to see that it's you. If that's not you, ring this number quickly. And I think that's the sort of thing that we've really got to drive to because, as Pete said, 2/3 of these are real accounts or start life as real accounts. So it's quite challenging.
Thank you. And we've heard about that some of these accounts are actually sold to people who then might be leaving the country. Do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to better, identify those people?
It's hard. I mean, what we do, we're monitoring activity. When we see the change in activity, we'll pick it up. But you're not perfect. As Karen said, we're looking for broadly one payment in every 25,000 payments is what we're looking for. So we'll find it, and we're trying to find it as quick as we can. But the inbound monitoring is probably the best thing, and that's new for us this year. Applying what we normally did to money going out of the bank to money coming into the bank as well. So we hadn't been doing that in previous years. So it's hard.
We obviously report it to the authorities when we see anything as well. People leave the country all the time. A lot of people leave the country and still customers and still operating from overseas. So it's not like everyone leaving the country sells their bank account.
Do you think there could be scope to make the original account holders liable somehow for
they're overseas
activity?
They're out of our reach. That's the challenge. That's if we look at investment scams, the biggest change we made was stop dealing with some digital currency exchanges, stop the money going out of the country. Once you're out of the country, you're beyond the reach of a lot of things. So it's hard. We just got to find it as quick as we can.
And again, coming back to these two examples of my constituents, both of them felt as well there was a lack of urgency and concern from Westpac around what happened to them, that it took time for them to be contacted. In one of the cases, the individual, Westpac informed the individual that they had been scammed and then provided them with an email about ways to protect themselves in future. This is a person who'd lost over $5 million. So, I mean, do you accept that, is this sort of the usual business as usual for Westpac, or do you, aim to deal with customers better than that in situations like this?
Well, that's really disappointing to hear, and so I'd love it if offline I could get those cases from you. I'd like to think that we offer a lot better service than that, because in these circumstances, our staff are trained to provide an enormous amount of empathy. These are life-changing moments for people. So really disappointed to hear that, and I'll look into those cases and apologise to those customers myself. We spend an enormous amount of effort in this space, and in fact I'd like to extend an invite to all members of the committee to come to our scam centre at Parramatta. We have 500 people who are fighting this crime every single day. They are incredibly passionate about it, and in fact the most distressing thing for them is when we think we've found a scam but we can't convince the customer on the other side that it's a scam, and then they ultimately find out it is a scam. And so it's devastating for our staff when that happens. So I'd like to think that's an unusual circumstance, but I'll look into those cases.
Thank you. And we've seen data around, the amount of money that is reimbursed to customers by the big banks. I quoted some data with Commonwealth Bank, which they said there's more recent data, but the data I have is that in the period from July 2021 to 2022, the big four banks paid a combined total reimbursement of approximately $21 million, and that the rate varied across the individual banks but ranged from only 4% to 5%. And where reimbursement occurred, the average amount was 36% of the amount that was stolen. So does that sound reasonable to you, or do you feel that banks could be reimbursing more of that money?
Well, our first thing is stop. So in our first half of this year, we stopped $120 million of customer losses. That's the figure we've got to get up, and we focus very much on that. And then in terms of losses, it was $70 million that customers lost in the first half. You're right, the reimbursement of that was not high. What we do on reimbursement is we look at it case by case, and we're broadly looking for things, as Carolyn said, if we've told a customer it's a scam and they still proceed with the payment, I think that's pretty clear. We wouldn't refund that because we feel like we've done what we would do. The flip case is where we don't do what we think we need to do, then we will consider reimbursement, and we don't think there's a lot of cases where that has been the case. But I think bring it back to where we started today, having a policy and a framework for the ecosystem. What are the expectations of social media, of telcos, of the customer, of the banks, set out in a framework that we can all agree, and then we set up our businesses, and then if we don't hit it, then that's when you have the conversation about reimbursement. But I would say that from the customer's perspective, we need one ombudsman for the whole system. So someone that looks across the ecosystem and deals with all of it. We don't want four. We don't want one for social media, one for telcos, one for the banks, and someone thinking about customers. We need it together is what we need. So the reason that rate is low is when we're looking at it case by case, we feel like we've done what we said we would do. The core challenge here are these are authorised payments. So it's not an unauthorised transaction, it is an authorised transaction. That's the heart of the issue. Going back about what are we doing to harden up the controls. I think the questions that we're pumping out when people make a payment that we think is dodgy is critical. We used to run all these algorithms in the back and we'd just stop the payment, and then the customer would go, "What did you stop at?" We flipped it on its head and said, right, generate questions, pump them into the point that the payment's being made, and we're helping educate customers at the same time as if they answer in a way that we think it's clearly a scam, we stop the payment. So those type of things I think are critical, And then maybe you just want to talk about the traffic light system for...
Yeah, so the questions in app that Pete's just mentioned, we went live on that in April, and since then we've interrupted 200 transactions to ask questions, and we've stopped $195 million in the moment. Some of it would proceed, but the lion's share of it, people will go, well, actually, I'm going to go and check on that. The traffic light system that Pete mentioned in his opening statement, that is where we're looking to match BSBs and account names and numbers in our massive database of everything we know. We will give you an amber if we haven't seen you transfer money to that account before, and we'll give you a red traffic light if it doesn't match what we think is the right name for that account number and BSB in our system. So 15% would be new, about 5% are wrong, and so that's also helping stop in the moment. And I think that's what Pete is saying too about the right policy position has got to be to stop the crime from occurring.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.